you know what I should do? I should go talk to them. I should, after class, walk up to them and say, hey, you said this thing and it really kind of bothered me. Can you tell me what you meant by that? Or like, here's why it bothered me. Do you want to respond? So it's delegitimizing this personal responsibility and making us want to publicize our own victimhood. The next thing would be identity politics and intersectionality. So identity politics is basically the very simple idea that the most important things about you are the immutable characteristics, specifically your race. And by knowing your race, I know a lot of things about you. And in her book, I'll get to that in just a second. And then intersectionality is written by a woman named Kimberly Crenshaw. And she said, feminists are trying to fight sexual oppression. And those who are doing racial, they're trying to fight racism. But she said, what happens when those two things intersect? So you could have like a white woman, and as a woman, she's a part of an oppressed group, but as a white person, she's part of an oppressor group. So then you could have a black man, and as a man, he's a part of an oppressor group, but as a black, he's a member of an oppressed group. But if you have a black woman, well, then you know how somebody has two oppressive groups. So it's been dubbed, sort of like an oppression Olympics. It's really trying to create a taxonomy about all the different ways a person can be oppressed. And people that have critiqued this idea have thought to themselves, well, wait a minute. People who are attractive have a privilege in life. A lot of people in this room have a privilege over me, which is one of the greatest privileges in the world, which is two-parent privilege. I was raised by a single parent. Should that be included when we think about oppression and oppressed? And the numbers can just become tens of thousands of these different categories. We'd have to define all the different ways a person is an oppressor or a person is oppressed. So that's what intersectionality is. The irony of this is that it was created ostensibly to fight racism and to fight oppression. But oftentimes, you know what it can lead to? Racism. And I want to give you my favorite example of this. And this comes from the National Museum. So this is the Smithsonian, and this is the National Museum for African Americans. And they created this for people, and it was basically, these are aspects and assumptions of whiteness and white culture in the United States. And the idea is we're creating this to know that you shouldn't impose whiteness on people of color. And so then they're talking about what white people value. And if you're white, this is what you value. But if you're a person of color, you shouldn't expect these things out of me because I'm not your culture. The problem is the kind of things they associate with whiteness are objective, rational, linear thinking. And hard work is the key to success. And being on time is important. So in other words, if you bought into this ideology and you're a white person who's bought in totally into the woke ideology, like, okay, so when I meet my friends who are people of color, I shouldn't expect them to be as rational, as on time, and probably maybe lazy. And do you know what that's called? Racism. People lost their minds about this, and then they eventually took it down because it went viral for good reason. Yes. So Robin DiAngelo, in her book White Fragility, says this: the simplistic idea that racism is limited to individual intentional acts committed by unkind people is at the root of virtually all white defensiveness on the topic. And she says at the beginning of the book, in the introduction, this work is deeply rooted in identity politics. Your identity is what group you're in is more important than the individual. And so a person who would say, well, I don't feel like I'm racist, to her, that doesn't matter. Let me just get back to, there we go. So she said, you have to think about the impact of your whiteness, not what you think or say. The problem is, as it's been pointed out by other people, it's an original sin with no salvation. And I remember watching this reality show where it was one of those like bachelor shows. Pray for me. And my sister watches it, and I was just, praying for her in the room. And this black man fell in love with this white woman, and he picked her, And then a picture came of her when she was in college. She went to like an antebellum party and she was wearing a dress. And so people really lost their minds and said, oh, see how terrible and racist she is. And so they called it off. We're not going to do this. I can't believe you do this. She's, like heartbroken. And I didn't mean anything by it. I was in college. I was stupid. I don't even know. I don't know. Just this college. Okay. And then there was a guy there who was brought in to navigate the situation. And she's like, what can I do? And he said, you need to do the work. You need to do the work. Now, she's like, okay. And I just wish she had asked this question. When will I know the work is done? Because you know what the answer to that question is? Never. The work's never done. That's an original sin with no salvation. Because she can't become less white, so she just bears it, right? So the Catechism of the Catholic Church says there is social sin. There are structures of sin. That's real, of course. And then my favorite author, Chesterton, says the mark of a good society is it makes it easy to be good. The mark of a bad society makes it easy to be bad. So we live in a very pornified culture. It's easy in our culture to find pornography. It's easy for kids to accidentally find it. It affects so many things about our culture. And that's like a social sin. It's real. It's easy to find. It's easy to get addicted to it, so on and so forth. But the Catechism says all social sin is rooted in personal sin. In other words, it doesn't just exist somewhere in the ether. It's always individuals making decisions, creating the websites, creating the videos, the pictures, sending them out, so on and so forth. But a lot of this idea, like what's in identity politics, is racism is just kind of in the ether, and there's nothing you can really do about it, and it's not rooted in individual actions or words or beliefs. And so you really can't do anything concrete about it. This is a criticism put forward by Ben Shapiro. He says when people accuse him of being racism or our culture is terribly racist, he says, okay, show me. Show me a policy, show me a person, show me a practice. And then if you show me, then we can partner together and we can fight it. Because I hate racism. But when it's it's just there. It's just in the ether. It's just, it's like whiteness. It's like, well, I can't do anything about that. I just literally can't do anything about that. And the problem is not my whiteness. The problem could be in your head that you're perceiving me this way. And I know ostensibly you're doing this to fight racism, but you're engaging in racism in an attempt to do that, which of course doesn't make any sense. And the other problem with this, of course, is if we just say it's in the ether, then when real racism occurs, it becomes harder to see it. Because people have a sense of the boy who cried wolf. Oh, they're calling everything racist. So the next time somebody says that was legitimately racist, and it becomes harder to delineate those things. So the second thing is will over reason. So one of the ways that modern people think about themselves is what's called expressive individualism. It's put forward in this delightful book, Strange New World. And he said the human person had to be psychologized, which he follows what we call the romantics, like who I am is really my desires. Then he said the human person had to be sexualized. That's Sigmund Freud. So the deepest and most important desires that I have are my sexual desires. And then the person had to be politicized, which is through Karl Marx, because what exists is only economic realities. So everything is economical, which means everything is political. Do you ever get that feeling in America? It feels like everything's then politicized? Karl Marx. You're welcome. Okay. So, will over reason. Expressive individualism is that I'm defined by my feelings, and I'm most myself when I'm expressing those. And so it's basically an authenticity on steroids. It's not rooted to anything. It's just my will expressing itself. And so again, the Frankfurt School, following Freud, said that to deny pleasure to yourself is a form of repression. It's to be inauthentic, which is why they eventually deny the natural law. What is the natural law? Catholics think authenticity is good. But we think authenticity is always tied to the authority of God and reality. So the natural law says that things that exist have a form and they have a purpose. And you can, through your intellect, look at the thing, like a tomato plant, and you can discover what it is. That's a plant. The form is a plant. And its purpose is to create tomatoes. And a plant is the kind of thing that if you want it to flourish, you want to put it in good soil, you want to give it water, and you want to take care of it, protect it from bugs. And if you give it good soil and water and sunshine, it will produce tomatoes. And if you want it to die, you put it in a closet and never water it, and it dies. So the natural law says things have purpose or function, and things will flourish insofar as you treat them according to their purpose or function. Does that make sense? This authenticity rejects all of that. I have desires, and even if my desires would be against traditional morality, well, they would just say, you've just internalized your repression. And that needs to all be thrown off. That's going to lead to neurosis, and that's not good for you. So that's why when you go to these, some of these parades, one of the things they say is fly your freak flag. That's interesting. And that's the point. I remember watching this thing probably a couple of months ago. It was really shocking. It was like a little kid, and it was like a gay pride parade in San Francisco, and people's body parts were blurred out, but there was just like naked people walking in the street. It's like, how is this allowed? But then there was like people wearing wings and like fantastical things. You're like, what is this about? Expressive individualism. I have these desires. My deepest desires are my sexual desires. I'm only free and authentic when I express all of them. I remember years ago I met this woman, and she said her daughter came to her. She was like 15. And she said, Mom, I'm a lesbian. She said, well, have you kissed somebody and liked it? She said, no. She goes, you're not a lesbian. Now, I'm not saying that's good advice. But the point is for a young person raised in our culture, if I have a desire, that defines me. That's who I am now. That's who I am. And at the heart of this movement of wokeism is it's anti-God. Because we believe in John chapter 1, verse 1 says this, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And that word in Greek is logos, or logos, which for Greeks meant the sum total of all rational laws. And then in John chapter 1, verse 14, it says, and the Word, the logos, became flesh and dwelt among us. So the God who holds into being spiral galaxies and the law of gravity and physics, that God took flesh and became one of us and a little baby. You're like, that's crazy. We call it Christmas. But the point is that God is rational. He's reason itself. When you study mathematics, you're studying a language, the intelligibility that God has embedded into the world. As Albert Einstein said, God made the integers, like he made mathematics. It's his language which bespeaks order and intelligibility. But wokeism is anti-reason because it reduces everything to power. It rejects all claims to truth. And any claim to truth is just a way for the oppressor to stay in power. Now, we're going to move into some of the tactics. The first is indoctrination through the sexual revolution. And basically the sexual revolution is a rejection of nature, natural law, and it's trying to convince us that sex is meaningless. Sex has no purpose or function. So I remember years ago I was walking to Mass at the cathedral in New Orleans, and I saw a woman, and I was like, that's kind of weird. She was holding a seashell. I was like, woman's holding a seashell. As I got closer, I realized the only clothes she was wearing was a seashell. I was like, this is very weird. New Orleans. And she was standing outside of a pornography shop, and their motto was, it's just sex, baby. When I was in high school, excuse me the crudeness of this. When I was in high school, there was a song, like a top 40. And the chorus of that song said, you and me, baby, ain't nothing but mammals. So let's do it like they do it on Discovery Channel. Yikes. The point is they're stripping sex of all beauty, order, purpose, or function. Recently, somebody on OnlyFans decided to have sex with 100 people within 24 hours. So sex is like utterly meaningless and purposeless. And so if a Catholic said, well, sex has a function, has a purpose, it's both unitive and procreative, it's for babies and bonding, it's built into the nature of our bodies, and when we use it according to its function, we flourish, and if we go against its function, we suffer. But somebody who's fully bought in this ideology would say, there is no reason, there's no truth. That's just your way to keep in power heteronormative thinking. That we're created male and female. That's just so binary, you know? A movie came out some years ago called The Shape of Water. And the movie, it's about a fish man who comes to the earth. And the woman protagonist ends up having sexual relations with this fish man. And it breaks basically every taboo. And Bishop Barron saw this movie with his friend. And when the movie was over, he turned to his friend and he said, that movie's going to win Best Picture. And do you know what happened in that movie? It won Best Picture. And do you know what shape water has? No shape. Water can be any shape. That's the point. It's a rejection of reason. It's a rejection of order and logos. It's trying to make sex meaningless. Now, I want to read to you a quote from a woman named Shulamith Firestone. She wrote a book called The Dialectic of Sex, The Case for Feminist Revolution. She says this, and just as the end goal of socialist revolution was not only the elimination of the economic class privilege, but of the economic class distinction itself, so the end goal of feminist revolution must be, unlike that of the first feminist movement, not just the elimination of male privilege, but of the sex distinction itself. Genital differences between human beings would no longer matter culturally. The tyranny of the biological family would be broken. Okay, you want to guess what year she wrote that in? 1970. And if you think about what she's saying, she's just taken Marxist ideology and she's applied it to marriage and sex. So you have the wife, or sorry, you have the husband, who again is the bourgeois. You have his wife, who's the proletariat. She's being oppressed. And one day she's going to rise up, which she said was the point of first wave feminism, was to throw off male privilege and to set the woman free. But just like in Marxist ideology, once you get past all the antithesis and thesis, you have the perfect synthesis where you don't have one class beating another class, but there is now no longer any class distinction. We have utopia. They've just applied that to sex and marriage, and there will come one day when there will be no gender, or any gender you want. Which is why even like LGBTQ, the Q is in a war with the L, the G's, and the B's, and the T's. Because a lesbian is a woman who's attracted to a woman. A bisexual is a person attracted to a man and woman. A gay person is a man attracted to a man. A transgender person is a person who's in a male body who thinks they should be in a female body. But queer ideology says that's all wrong. There is no binary. Gender is on a spectrum. Because there's only two options. Gender, sex, is either something we receive or we make up. What species you are, do you receive that or do you make that up? Yeah, you receive it. What color your money is, do you receive that or do you make that up? We make it up. Other countries have different color. How many different colors could your money be? Exactly. So people were shocked when like Facebook first came out and they had 54 different genders to choose from. 54 genders, you know? But if it's something we make up, and if we apply Marxist ideology to the family, we're trying to eliminate the sex distinction itself. And then she says, the tyranny of the biological family will be broken. Whoa, it's all just about power. We're trying to overcome heteronormative thinking. And that's why when you go on Black Lives Matter, somebody in good faith could have gone there to fight racism, and then they find about establishing queer networks and breaking the heteronormative thinking. Like, what does that have to do with racial justice? But if you understand Marx mixed with Freud, it all makes sense. It's all looking for oppression in all these different ways and fighting it. So the next thing would be thought and speech control. I recently read 1984 by George Orwell. And there's something called the Ministry of Truth, and they would come out with dictionaries in the book. And their job was to eliminate words every year. The dictionary would get smaller and smaller. And they changed the definition of words to support the party against its enemies. And if you think about it, words and thoughts are so intimately connected. It's almost impossible to think without using words. When you write an essay or you write a paper, you're just thinking on paper. When you say that person is a really clear thinker, the only way you know that is because of the words they use, right? So thinking and words are so intimately connected. Dr. Peter Kreeft says words are like idea houses, and words are supposed to show an idea. St. Augustine once said that words, those precious cups of meaning, that a word is most accurately used of how close it gets to the meaning you're trying to convey. That's why we say somebody's very articulate, they're a very clear thinker. I mean, they use words very well. So if you want to change the way people think, you control their words. These are the things you can say. These are the things you cannot say. And you just make it forbidden. And in her book, Noel Manning, she says, critical theory has replaced critical thinking. And critical thinking was a search for truth at its best. And I want to invite the best argument of the person against me, what we call steel manning. Straw manning is the fallacy where I present your argument as being much weaker to easily defeat it. Steel manning is I pick the best of your argument against my argument. Because everyone wants to be right, but I want to have enough humility to say I really am searching for truth. So I want to bring the best argument in what I'm saying and have to refine my argument so I'm getting closer to the truth. That's critical thinking at its best. But critical theory doesn't believe in truth. And you're looking for power, and when you find power, you're just using words to criticize it, to get power back. They give a lot of criticism, but they don't never invite criticism. And just to give you how far this goes, if you've ever seen like somebody like a Ben Shapiro, he goes and gives a speech at a college campus. People will show up, and they'll just scream. They'll just stomp things. And you would think this. Well, if you think he's wrong, he has like 100 hours. He has like 1,000 hours of content. He's written all these books. Why not just research what he's written? You're going to know probably a lot of what he's going to say. Then you can show up, listen to the talk, wait for the Q&A, and then you can debate him. Why not do that? You can debate him in front of everyone and win and convince them. But people who are fully bought in would say this. He's an oppressor. He has the power. He's white, straight, he's Jewish. And even his claims to free speech are just tools he's using to stay in power. Free speech itself must be criticized and rejected. Because we're trying to disrupt power. That's what critical theory is. And so we have to be careful of the words that we use. Equity, if you mean by equality of opportunity, that's a very good thing. We want an equal shot in America. We want an equal shot in a just society. If you mean equality of outcomes, then it means that unless we have exactly what we want as an outcome, there's an assumption there must be some nefarious reason, some sort of sexism, some sort of racism. That's what happened. But I'll just give you one example. There are a lot more men in prison than women. Did you know that? Yeah. And do you know why? Because there's a worldwide feminist conspiracy against men. That's why. It's not why. Do you know why? Men disproportionately commit violent crimes over women. So they end up in prison more. That's just how it works. There's not an equality of outcome. They're not about 50% of women in prison, 50% of men. Men commit more crimes. They go to jail more often. So that's not an equality of outcome, but it's just, it doesn't allow for things like merit or choice or preference, which is very natural. One of my favorites, I actually got this from the atheist Sam Harris. He says, I want one day to go to a place where race is about as important as eye color. You know what I mean? Did you hear? What? We had our first blue-eyed Chief Justice on the Supreme Court. We've never had a blue-eyed person. I know. We just had our first redhead. God bless him. We've never had a redhead on the Supreme Court, right? It's the least interesting thing about you. You didn't choose it. It's an immutable characteristic. What you think, what you desire, your dreams, your goals, your individuality, that's the most interesting thing about you. So again, critical theory, this search for power, and always assuming oppression, has replaced critical thinking. So we have diversity, but it's, of course, never of thought. So we want to have the right kinds of people on your team, the oppressed. But if they say something that isn't aligned with the ideology, they get kicked out. Like the pro-life women at the Women's March. Or a black man saying conservative ideology. Well, he's no longer black, right? So they don't want diversity of thought. And then lastly, discrimination. Discrimination just means to sift apart. Some years ago, I was in Mexico. And I was like, I gotta use the restroom. So I went and I saw the doors, and I saw the door that had a big M on it, and I walked in with confidence. Now, I don't know if you know what the Spanish word for women is, but it is mujer, which starts with an M. And I went in there with confidence. And I went in, and I was wearing clerics, and this woman was washing her hands, and we made eye contact through the mirror. And I was like, como se dice uncomfortable? I don't know, and I rolled out of there. Okay, the point is this. The doors were discriminating, but it wasn't an unjust discrimination. It was a just discrimination. Every year, thousands of people apply to go to Stanford, and then they give them a score based on their test scores, their GPA, what things they're involved in, and then they discriminate. They sift apart the students we think are going to absolutely excel here, accepted, on the fence, waitlisted. It would be unjust to accept this student. They would not do well here. They get rejected. But it's not an unjust discrimination. So when people use the word discrimination in our culture, we almost always mean immediately must have been unjust discrimination. But there is just discrimination. You just have to make that distinction. So again, these words are important that we try to use them properly. Next would be education activism. John Dewey has had an incalculable effect on public education. John Dewey was connected with Columbia University when the Frankfurt School was right next to it. And he was a staunch atheist and socialist. And he loved Soviet countries. I don't even know that. He visited Russia. He wrote glowingly about it. And he once said this, quote, "Our special concern here is with the role of the schools in building up forces and factors whose natural effect is to undermine the importance and uniqueness of family life." Truth doesn't exist. So schools are not about knowledge. They're about social change. Do you remember when COVID was going on? And the California school boards were saying, like, we can't go back to school. You're putting our lives in danger. And then at one point, the national health people said, no, it's probably appropriate to go back to school now. And then they had these secret emails, like, where they were pushing back. They said, we have these demands, and unless our demands are met, we're not going back to school. Like, okay. And one of the demands was defund the police. I cannot teach children unless all the police are defunded. So basically, it just reveals it's really about the ideology. This has nothing to do with kids. This has nothing to do with teaching and learning. This has to do with schools exist for social change. This is the change we want, and we're going to leverage the education system to get what we want. Well, that's crazy. Well, we've been doing with your kids for a long time. So the other thing, some years ago, there was in the Florida bill, it got instantly dubbed like the Don't Say Gay bill. And all it was you cannot speak to young children about sexual preference, 7, 8-year-olds. I personally believe if you have a deep desire to talk about your sexual preference to 7, 8-year-olds, you shouldn't be teaching 7 or 8-year-olds, but that's a belief of mine. But anyway, what's interesting to me about questions about sexual morality, sex education, transgender ideology, is oftentimes they've now written bills where if the teacher mandates that the child is in a toxic home, which is to say the child feels they're stuck in the wrong body, they experience gender dysphoria, which of course is real and I imagine very painful. And if they were to go home and tell their parents, and their parents would say, oh no, honey, like God made you a woman, and I'm sorry you don't feel comfortable, but he loves you and I love you, and we're gonna help you accept your body, and it's good, it's a gift, your body's a gift. And then that person went back and told their teacher, then their home could be dubbed a toxic environment, and they could begin to cut out the parents from conversations. Now, I got a master's degree in education some years ago through NAU, and in laws written in the schools, it often say the school acts in Latin in loco parentis. In loco parentis. Do you know what that means in Latin? In the place of parents. That is school. A teacher should always have in the back of their mind, is this aligned with the wishes of the parents for this child? So I think there's lots of discussions sometimes about sexual morality in schools and sex education and transgenderism. But for me, there's even a more foundational question, which is this. Who does a child firstly and ultimately belong to? Is a child a ward of the state? Or are they the loving fruit of a sexual union between a man and a woman? The son or daughter of a mom and dad? And sometimes we immediately get to the secondary thing where I think Americans in the 1950s, if you taught their kids things they didn't want you, they would have lost their minds. Like, what right do you have to teach my child that without my permission? And so anyway, the point is they're using the schools to bring about the social change they want. I read an article some years ago that I love called The End of the University by a guy named Sir Roger Scruton. He's a great philosopher. And he said, he's writing about when young men would go to Oxford. And what they would do is they'd be introduced to what's been called the best of what's thought and said of Western civilization. And the best poetry, literature, art, architecture, history. And he said 2 things were meant to happen. They were supposed to fall in love with it. Fall in love with Western civilization. So they become a lover, and then a guardian, and a bequeather of it. So I'm now entering what's called the Great Conversation. I've learned to grow in truth, beauty, love, goodness.